Good evening, everyone. We're going to be picking up with our Proverbs Bible study tonight. Proverbs chapter 5. Proverbs chapter 5. We had just gotten just the beginning of this chapter here. And so what we've seen so far is that this is another one of Solomon's speeches to his sons. And in this one, the main topic throughout the whole chapter is adultery. And so this is what Solomon is warning and giving advice to his sons about. And so he started, as he usually does, by entreating them to pay attention so that they understand the importance of his words. And then he starts getting into this. And what he started with was he explained that the adulteress is tempting. Right? That doesn't sound like much of a surprise, but he explained that the words that she uses will be enticing, they'll be sweet, they'll be smooth. And so he's helping his sons to identify what kind of character to watch out for. What are the warning signs that should set off red flags in their minds, right? These are things that, should be warning signals to them. And so he's setting this up. And he told them that despite the sweet and smooth speech, her end is death, right? This is someone who their path will lead to no good. Their end will be bitter, okay? He goes as far as in verse 6 to say that this person, this adulteress, this is someone who's unstable. In their ways, they're unstable, right? This is someone who doesn't consider the consequences of their actions, where it will ultimately lead or how it will affect others, okay? And so that's where we're picking up tonight is verse 7. Verse 7, okay? Let me skip ahead here. So Solomon is repeating his call for attention here in verse 7, and this time he's repeating it to his sons instead of just a single son. So we've got repetition for emphasis, and we've got a broader audience. He says in verse 7, "Now then, my sons, listen to me, and do not turn away from the words of my mouth." Okay. He says, "Keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, otherwise you will give your vigor to others, and your years to the cruel one. And strangers will be filled with your strength, and your hard-earned possessions will go to the house of a foreigner." Okay, so we'll pause there for just a second. So Solomon warns them of the kind of person that they need to watch out for and the reason why, right? There's consequences to this. And so what does he recommend for them? What course of action should they take when they encounter this smooth talker, this person whose end is no good? He gives them advice in verse 7 and 8. What does he say? Matt?
Stay away.
Stay away, right? The easiest way to deal with this is to not approach this person, to just keep your distance, to stay away. That will keep you out of a world of trouble, right? He says, don't listen, keep far away, do not go near. Okay, Solomon recommends avoiding this woman. And last week, I forget who it was, but someone had mentioned the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, right? And so that's a great example. So if you go back to Genesis chapter 39, you can see Joseph finds himself in a similar situation and he flees. Rick?
Right, and Paul tells us to flee, just like Joseph.
Right.
Flee those situations.
Right. And Joseph did that quite literally, right? He ran out, right? So he's very literal about that. So the best way to deal with this is just to avoid it altogether, right? That's the best way that you can handle this. Now, if you fail to heed Solomon's warning, though, what do you stand to lose? Verses 9 and 10. Go ahead.
Honor and dignity.
Honor and dignity, right? So you're giving up something of your character here, right? There's a fundamental downgrade that's happening to you, loss of honor. He says loss of years. Some translations say time or vitality, going to the same idea, right? He also says loss of material wealth or possessions, loss of health, right? And it's easy to see how those things could happen. When you get mixed up in adultery, that leads to messy situations. It could eat up years of your time dealing with the fallout of that. You can lose wealth, if there's divorces or conflicts that are involved, you could lose material possessions. There's loss of health, right? There's not just the effects of worry and frustration that take their toll on your body, but disease is a possibility as well. So there are all kinds of ways that this can backfire on you. And Solomon's giving a few of these examples to his sons. He says in verse 11, he says, and in the end, you will groan. When your flesh and your body are consumed, and you say, how I hated instruction, and my heart disdainfully rejected rebuke. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers, nor incline my ear to instructors. I was almost in total ruin in the midst of the assembly in the congregation. So bottom line, he says, you're going to regret doing this, right? Here are the things that you stand to lose, and in the end, you will look back and you'll regret it, right? You'll suffer the consequences and you'll kick yourself for it, because Solomon's here giving you that exact warning, right? He's telling you what you stand to lose. You've heard that. And then if you go ahead with it, you're going to kick yourself in the end because you knew how it was all going to turn out. That's what he's saying. But then he says something at the end of that, there in verse 14. He says this line. He says, in the midst of the assembly and the congregation. So it's not just going to be a private matter, right? He says, I was almost in total ruin in the midst of the assembly and the congregation. The assembly and the congregation in Solomon's time would be what? Right, when they gather at the temple or the synagogue, right? In the New Testament times, it would be this congregation, right? It's when God's people get together to worship.
So, sounds like this was going on, and maybe at first it was private, secret, but then like you're saying, it came out, right?
Right.
Of everything, so
that
would be pretty rough, right?
Right. It's not going to stay hidden, right? It's going to come out. It's going to make itself known. And so you can see this is like Solomon is painting this very likely scenario that, even now we see situations happen like that, right? And all these terrible things happen, and then it becomes broadly known, and it's even worse, right? Again, loss of honor, loss of dignity, loss of time, loss of life, things like that. And so this is a bad situation, but Solomon is laying it out very plainly so that his sons are aware of what they stand to lose. And so hopefully they'll at least pause and think about this before they get themselves into a bad situation. Okay? So Solomon has essentially outlined what not to do, right? Don't do that. But then what should you do, right? Well, he did say we could flee. That's one option that he gave. We want to know what the correct path is, though. Instead of getting mixed up in adultery and immorality, what should we do? Well, Solomon spells it out very directly for his sons. Let's drop down to verse 15 in chapter 5. In verse 15, it says, drink from the water of your own cistern, and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs overflow into the street, streams of water into the public squares? Let them be yours alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. Like a loving doe and a graceful mountain goat, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. Okay, and we'll pause there. So the first thing he does is he directs his sons back to marriage, right? That's the very first thing he does. And he uses this example. He likens marriage to pure waters, or it says, your version might say fresh water. It might say flowing water. The idea here is a well would have fresh water because it's moving water, right? If you have water that doesn't move, it grows stagnant and foul, right? So this idea of living water or flowing water or moving water, that equals pure water or fresh water, right? And he explains, this is your well. This is the best water, and this is just for you, right? This isn't supposed to be for everyone. This isn't a well in the town square. This is just you. This is a private well. And this had more significance back during those days because water was a rare commodity at times, and so if you had a well on your property, this would be something that you would go to lengths to protect. This was something that you would guard. So he's likening it to that. He also says to be exhilarated always with her love. And so let's take a moment to look at that word exhilarated there. The Hebrew word there is saga, and it means intoxicated. So that gets translated a few different ways, depending on which version of the Bible that you're reading out of. So if you're reading out of the King James Version, it'll say ravished. If you're reading out of the New King James, it'll say enraptured. If you're reading out of the New American Standard, like I am, it'll say exhilarated. Right? So all of these are slightly different words, but they're all synonyms. They all have this same idea, right? This is how you should react to your marriage, right? With your spouse. This should be the attitude that his son should have rather than being tempted by somebody outside of their marriage, right? To be exhilarated with her love, right? So again, as you read down through this particular passage, you notice it talks about a marriage relationship in a way that maybe we don't usually talk about marriage, right? One of the things that's not really common in the Church of Christ is talking openly about handling sexual matters, right? It's just not usually something that we would consider maybe polite in public. It's more of a private thing. And so it tends not to make its way into sermons to the same degree as maybe baptism or faith or things like that. And yet we see here Solomon spending quite a bit of time going over this matter. Rick?
Yeah, we could, we could talk about it a number of different ways. Always when I think of like scripture like this or what we see Paul saying, what God is telling us is to focus our love and that energy on our wife. That's where it belongs, and that's who we should always remember and keep that love for. And we shouldn't be allowing ourselves to be tempted elsewhere, but put our focus. Why did we fall in love with her? Why did we love her? Think of those things and really focus on her. And that really goes both ways, but in this case, he's talking more to his son. So.
Right. And I think I have a passage from Paul. I don't know if it's that one. I might be skipping ahead here a tiny bit, but basically Solomon is explaining that there's a clear way to handle sexual feelings that is a godly way, right? First of all, we know that God created the institution of marriage, right? Turn with me over to Matthew for just a minute. In Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 and 5, it says, "And he answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So Jesus is explaining that God created the institute of marriage. This is a good thing, right? And then later, Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and he's explaining that sexual intimacy is a good thing in a marriage. turn with me over to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 2 down to verse 5. It says, "But because of sexual immoralities," right? That's what Solomon was talking about. He says, "Each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must then fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does also not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." He says in verse 5, "Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Not to go on a tangent here, but when Paul was writing his letter to the Corinthians, it was because they were getting confused by a few New Testament concepts. And one of the things that the Corinthians heard from Paul was, immorality is bad. And if you think to what they were dealing with in Corinth, there was all this pagan worship. And much pagan worship had to do with orgies and things like that. There was a lot of immorality and infidelity in there. And so they were to be a different kind of people. But what was going on was some Corinthians were getting the wrong idea. Some Corinthian Christians were getting the wrong idea and thinking that Paul was saying that all sex is bad, right? And so they were abstaining even from sex with their husband and wife, right? Even within the bounds of a marriage, which is allowed, they were abstaining from that because they got the wrong message. They took Paul's instruction too far, right? And so Paul is explaining, no, right? He's explaining that's not the same thing. It's only immorality. It's sex outside of marriage, which is the bad thing. Sex within marriage, within your marriage, this is the good thing, right? And so he's trying to explain that to them. So these verses, and there are others in the Bible, that paint a picture of a healthy marriage and what it should look like. As a matter of fact, when we get to Song of Solomon, there's a lot more about this idea. And it goes into the attitude that a husband should have towards his wife and vice versa, right? The idea is that they should desire one another, not outward. And so that's what Solomon is trying to drive home here to his sons. So let's pause for a moment. And based off of what Solomon has explained to his sons, what are some applications that we in modern day times can take away from this?
Well, still flee sexual immorality of all kinds,
right?
Stay away from, we know in this culture, porn is a big thing, and we can avoid all of that.
Right. Right. Avoid adulterous people in a big way, right? Flee from them. He uses very strong language there. So avoid it altogether, right? What else can we learn? Matt?
Cherish our spouse.
Yeah, cherish our spouse. Respect the sanctity of our marriage. Be intoxicated with your spouse, right? So there are a few applications that we can get there. Another one that perhaps we can consider is how to handle what can be an uncomfortable topic, right? I don't encounter a lot of Christians where we're talking about sex on a regular basis. Like I said, it's not a topic that makes its way into sermons very often, unless it's to say something along the lines of flee immorality or things like that. And we have lots of euphemisms that we'll use to even avoid saying the word sex, right? Because it's uncomfortable and we don't want to talk about that. The problem is there needs to be a time to talk about that, especially for someone young so that they know what they need to do. And what we see is that Solomon is approaching an uncomfortable topic head on. He does not mince words for his sons. And you notice he's not being vulgar. That's not the idea here. He's not trying to be lewd or anything like that. He's simply trying to be clear and direct for his sons. Solomon would rather be blunt and explain it clearly to these young men than to have them fall into adultery. And so I think an application that we can consider here is maybe making sure that when we're talking about these sensitive subjects, that we actually take the time and maybe overcome the uncomfortableness to say what we actually mean and not confuse people, right? Rick?
And we should always remember that love is a choice, and we should always choose to love our spouse, right?
Right.
That should be just a daily, regular. There's going to be times you're going to be upset.
Sure.
Have things going on, but always come back to the fact that you love your spouse. That's who you love. That's who you want. And keep that focus.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It is a choice, right? And we're told that husbands love your wives, right? That's an action. It's not a passive thing. It's an action. And sometimes that can take work. Maybe on some days it takes more work than other days. Maybe on some days it's easy, right? But either way, it's something that we have to do. Matt?
Not to take away from your idea that he's being clear and straightforward, but he is using poetic language with the sister and
Sure.
and so I mean maybe some of that.
He is using poetry, but I would counter that. Like look at verse 19. He's pretty direct, right?
Yeah.
So yes, I would say he's doing a very wise job, as he is a wise man, of explaining, again, a sensitive topic in a way that he is very clear. He is using direct language, but he's also not being lewd, right? He's doing a really good job of walking that fine line. Addie, you had your hand up.
Well, I don't know if I can say this right, but young people have hormones flowing through their body, and it doesn't take much to be enticed away from.
Sure.
And so you've got to remember, God made that institution. Once you commit yourself to that woman or that man, He expects you to keep that commitment and not wander off in these affairs.
Right. And you bring up a good point. Solomon is addressing his sons in this regard, right? But this certainly is a topic that can be reversed, right? Just as this is talking about how husbands should react towards their wives, this can easily be flipped and talk about how wives should be towards their husbands, right? Wives should not seek out immorality either, right? That's not the way that this should work. This is a thing that goes both ways, right? He just happens to be speaking to his sons in this instance. So then picking up in verse 21, excuse me. In verse 21, he says, "For the ways of everyone are before the eyes of the Lord, and he observes all his paths. His own wrongdoings will trap the wicked, and he will be held by the ropes of his sin. He will die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his foolishness, he will go astray." Okay? So Solomon is kind of going back to this idea that adultery, when committed, will become public, right? He had stopped on that tangent for a minute to explain what his son should do, which is to seek out marriage there. But he goes back to this idea that adultery becomes public. In other words, he says that God sees everything. God sees everything. In verse 21, "For the ways of everyone are before the eyes of the Lord," right? Whatever you think is hidden is not hidden. You could hide something from every person on earth, but it's not hidden from God. God knows what's going on, okay? And he repeats an idea that he's been bringing up more than once, that the wicked will be trapped by their own sins, right? We often talk about that, being in bondage to sin. We become trapped by our own sins. And then he's connecting all of this back to wisdom. So what is, according to Solomon here, the number one reason someone would likely pursue adultery? What's that?
Being dumb.
Being dumb. Yeah, he says, for lack of instruction. If no one warns you about the dangers of adultery, you're more likely to fall into that trap, right? If you don't know that there's a bad consequence to it, you might think that this will play out okay. He doesn't want his sons to fall into this trap simply because no one took the time to talk to them. And so he is giving them this instruction. If no one tells you how foolish it is, you may just be swept away by it. And so he's explaining that to his sons. Any thoughts, questions, or comments wrapping up chapter 5? That's the end of that speech. Okay. So let's move on to the next one. This is his 9th speech, and this covers the entirety of chapter 6. All right, so just a little recap. So far, we've had 8 speeches and 2 poems. And again, we're going over the idea of the importance of wisdom, the benefits of having it, the consequences of not having it. We just spent time looking at how adultery, if we fall into that due to lack of wisdom, has some serious consequences to it. Okay? And again, as we look at verse 1 of chapter 6, he says, my son, if you have become a guarantee for your neighbor or have given a handshake to a stranger, if you have become ensnared by the words of your mouth or caught by the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. So stop there for just a minute. Notice in this first section, you're going to see words like snare and caught and hunter, fowler, robber, capture, thief. You'll see that in the beginning here and then throughout the rest of this chapter. So are you seeing a connecting theme there, right? There's hunting. Hunting is this snare. Solomon in this speech is warning his sons about 4 hunters, right? There are 4 things that will try and ambush their soul and rob them of a good life. 4 things, okay? And so in this first section, we'll read it again real quick. In this first section, try to think of what the hunter is. What is the thing that is trying to ensnare the son? If you have become a guarantor for your neighbor or have given a handshake for a stranger, if you have been ensnared by the words of your mouth or caught by the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. Since you have come into the hand of your neighbor, go humble yourself and be urgent with your neighbor to free yourself. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. Save yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. So who is the first hunter? Matt?
I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for, but financial slavery, being a co-signer, poverty, something like that.
Yeah. No, you got it. You got it. Financial bondage, debt, right? Debt's what I'm going for here. Or something similar. It's the same idea, right? Solomon doesn't want his sons to fall into debt because falling into debt is a snare that can rob you of good things in your life. That's what he's talking about. And so Solomon explains some examples of how this could happen, how it could spring up. Rick?
Yeah, he's talking about a surety for your friend. When you promise to take care of a friend's debt as a backup, that a lot of times kills your friendship. It kills your like for us, it kills your credit. It kills your finances because then you end up getting stuck with that a lot of times, right? So.
But shouldn't we bear each other's burdens, Rick?
Well, yes, but
Okay, but my thing is this. If my friend needs something, if I have it, I give it to him. I don't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the difference.
Right.
So we're told to give, not expect anything in return. So,
Matt?
Well, the trick is it's sort of like you're helping him afford something with a loan.
Right.
It's not even your loan, right?
Right.
You're just caught up in it. Like he can't actually afford it. It's the whole reason he needs you.
Right.
So, yeah, like Rick said, if you're gonna help them and give them something, maybe there's less strings attached than just a gift. But
Right.
this guy, if you help some stranger, if you don't know him from anybody, he gets caught up and he loses his whole estate. Well, now
Right.
like you're sinking with the anchor, you're falling into the sea, so financially.
Right. Exactly. So helping a neighbor seems innocent enough, right? But if you do it unwisely, you can find yourself in big problems. So, like Matt and Rick were saying, if you give someone a gift because they need a little bit of money to make ends meet, you helped them, right? You gave of your excess and you helped them. But if you start co-signing on credit cards and things like that, all of a sudden your credit is tied to their credit. And if they have poor behaviors that are leading them into debt, they can now drag you into debt, right? So this is a case where you could go into this with good intentions. You're not going into it, trying to gamble away your finances or anything like that. You're trying to help someone. But if you do it unwisely, you can put yourself in a bad situation. So this is where that wisdom comes in, right? Yes, you can help someone, but you need to do it wisely. Rick?
I've seen this go wrong in family as well. So just be aware.
Yeah.
It's never a good thing.
Right. Well, and he mentions a handshake. It might be a little bit informal, right? But you can still get yourself in trouble by agreeing to take on some debt, right? He says, being caught by your own words. This is one we can get in trouble with, right? Thinking before we speak. That's a whole nother sermon that we could write. But you can get in trouble just by speaking before you think. And so Solomon is warning them against this. You may come into debt just by trying to help, or you may come into debt being caught by your own words. However it happens, though, if you find yourself in this unlucky predicament, what does Solomon advise you to do? Because again, you might have ended up here, with the best intentions, but it went poorly. Matt?
Run, don't walk. To get out of this mess that you
Right.
want to be in.
Right. Run, don't walk. Yeah. Bottom line, get out of debt quickly, right? This is not a situation that you want to stay in for a long period of time. Rick?
And he says to humble yourself and plead with your friend.
Yeah.
Don't make the matter worse by going angrily, but
Right.
humble yourself and plead with your friend to help
Right.
clear this up.
See if you can get out of that situation. Can you get your name taken off of there, right? Plead with them. Solomon advises dogged persistence to the point of losing sleep if you have to make this happen. Notice what he says in verse 4. Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids. If that's what it takes to get out of this, then do that, right? You need to get out of it. Paul echoes this same principle in Romans. In Romans chapter 13, verse 8, Paul says, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For the one who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law, right? Avoid that earthly debt because that can be an anchor that drags you down. Okay? So we'll stop there for tonight. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the other hunters and snares that his sons could face and see what advice Solomon has. Thank you, everyone.